Let me introduce our guest tonight. We have with us Dr. Timothy Kneeland. Dr. Kneeland is professor of almost everything at NAS. I looked it up earlier, history, politics, and some other things, public policy and whatever. So he's here to talk to us about elections. This is kind of a tradition. We love hearing his take on the elections. So Tim, take it away. Tell us what you learned, what you think, what's coming, what it means.
All right, sounds great. And again, welcome everyone. Thanks for inviting me. And I will be looking forward to questions. Now, for some of you, particularly my students, some of the beginnings going to sound familiar to you. So just sit tight and it will get right into the meat of what's just happened. So we start out obviously with this red wave. Everyone, the last few weeks of the election was talking about the red wave, and it didn't happen. So that's certainly the first thing we need to think about. What did happen and why did it happen, right? What happened to this red wave that was supposed to bring dominance of the Republicans in the House and the Senate and threaten the Democratic leadership in the state of New York, among other places that people have been talking about. So in the overview of the presentation, we're going to talk about, the midterms in general, the political environment of this particular midterm, what happened, and what do we think it means, and what we can look forward to, or maybe not look forward to in the next couple of years. So first of all, background. And again, some of this may be familiar to you, but look, midterms really are an important aspect of taking the temperature of American politics. They happen every 2 years in between presidential elections. We look at these as a sign of where is the American polity heading, right? It's really hard to get your hands on something called public opinion. We try to measure it through polls and other things, but it's variable. Elections have a little more meaning, and certainly the outcome of elections have a lot of meaning. So they tend to be referenda on what are people thinking. Oftentimes, it's the incumbent party that's under scrutiny. In this case, this election at least, that may not be the case. So as we're looking at this, one of the questions we look at is, all right, going into the midterm, what's the overall presidential approval rating? Most presidents would like to have that above 50%. Below 50% tends to be a harbinger of bad news. Do people feel the country is headed in the right direction? Yes or no? The more people, and as a percentage, feel the country's moving in the right direction, the better it is for the incumbent party. And then finally, how do people feel about the state of the economy? Are things moving in the right direction? Is the economy solid? These are all the kind of things that in the past, certainly, we have looked at and found that as a pattern, we can expect if approval rating is down, if people feel the country's heading in the wrong direction, and if the state of the economy is not good, then the incumbent party, in this case, Joe Biden and the Democrats, generally would have been experiencing a red wave. Certainly, if you look at historic trends during the last, half century or so, if you look at the average number of seats shifting in the House, it's 23. And the Republicans only needed to pick up 5 to get control of the House. So again, there's your sense of a wave. Anything over 19 seats is considered a wave. For example, in 2018, the Democrats won 38 seats and took control of the House in the midterm election that demonstrated people's unhappiness or disaffection with Donald Trump, who had just won the presidency in 2016. So as we think about the system that we're in, the system tends to favor incumbents. So even as we're looking at numbers like 23 or sometimes 38, it's really hard to topple somebody who's been elected more than once to the same seat in the House or Senate. These are incumbents, and they have tremendous power in terms of name recognition. They get in the paper all the time. They show up to cut ribbons for this or that. They put on the silly hard hat and they take the golden shovel and they put it into the ground when somebody's doing some new construction work, and it's going to be covered in the local news. And so they tend to have a great deal of coverage. Now, somebody who's outside of politics and out has a much harder time unless they too have been in some position of power or authority. Because of their ability to get name recognition and to raise tremendous amounts of money, incumbents tend to scare off anybody who wants to challenge them, both within their party, so they don't have to worry about primaries, but then also to chase off people who don't want to spend a lot of time and money and energy pursuing a seat in the House or Senate that they simply can't win. And those scare-off effects mean that a lot of times incumbents are like Rocky in Rocky 3. If you remember that movie, Rocky had not faced a tough contender in a year. They kept putting up the weakest opponents for Rocky so he could just knock them down and keep the heavyweight championship. But then Rocky meets Mr. T and he loses his championship. There, I'm just giving you the way the movie. The point being, though, that in most cases, incumbents secure their seats and maintain that. House 90% incumbency rate. In the Senate, that's 80%. Sometimes there's a retirement as people leave the House. That's one of the things that happened in 2018. Number of Republicans retired, which allowed a resurgence of Democrats to take their place. Due to gerrymandering and the incumbency, the Cook Political Report, which is nonpartisan, said there were only about 36 seats that were really competitive in this election cycle. So picking up 38 seats would have been difficult for the Republicans in a good year. This year, they certainly did not pick up a wave at all. As we think about incumbents, and we think particularly about the local election here, like Joe Morelli, he was very home style. He was, I'm one of you, and he was able to draw on local individuals for his campaign commercials who talked about what Joe Morelli had done for them, how he'd been there for them as the incumbent, and to see him as a part of the Rochester and Monroe County community. Joe didn't necessarily have to have Joe Biden come visit. He was able on his own to weave together a campaign that was built upon what he'd already accomplished. And certainly he had some negative ads, or people who were in favor of him paid for negative ads about his opponent, LaRon Singletary. Oftentimes trying to suggest that LaRon Singletary and Donald Trump were best buddies somehow. And that's what you do. You try to define your opponent as the worst and celebrate your accomplishments. The challenger, and that was LaRon Singletary in our local election in the 25th, was looking at the incumbent as being out of touch, a weakness of the incumbent on the issues. And particularly, LaRon hammered Joe on crime and the inability for the state or the nation to respond to the rising crime rate. And why did he do that? Well, because he was a former police chief. So he had the law and order image already secured in his mind. He also talked about the economy, and the economy, as you know, has been problematic. So he went very negative and tried to tie Joe Morelli to the unpopularity, perhaps, of Joe Biden. Meanwhile, making things difficult for both sides is the turnout is lower in the midterms than during presidential election years. 2018 was a bit of an anomaly in that we had percentages of voters across the country that nearly mirrored what we see in presidential elections. We also see that midterms tend to attract more educated voters. That is, there is a strong relationship and correlation between people who vote in these midterm elections and having above a high school level education. We also find that women often make up more of the electorate, and they tend to favor Democrats. men tend to favor the Republican Party slightly, but over the last several election cycles, the electorate has been 52% female, 48% male. Younger voters also, when they vote, tend to like the Democrats, and older voters, the Republicans. So these are all trends that we would expect in the midterm election to bear out. And so looking at 2022 specifically, right, there were a number of changes in our elections. Some states like Oregon, Montana, Colorado, Texas, and Florida, North Carolina picked up seats as we took the 435 seats in the House, reevaluated where they should be due to the decennial census, and then reapportioned and reallocated those seats. States like in the Great Lakes region all lost seats, as you can see, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and California for the first time ever lost congressional seats, and these were put in other areas. Now, what's interesting is Florida and Texas are showing themselves to be more and more Republican. They are now largest states outside of California. Meanwhile, poor Joe Biden's approval ratings have been in a steady decline. They've hovered somewhere between 45 and 40 over the last several months, which again, typically, if you look at elections since 1962, have led to a loss of up to 39 seats. But thinking about some other factors, type of voters who come out in midterms, the advantage of incumbents, these are issues or factors that may have inhibited any kind of challenge to Joe Biden. Americans' satisfaction with the way things are going in the U.S., not particularly high in the last several months. Inflation, crime, and concerns about reproductive rights have all emerged as key issues that have made voters very unsatisfied with America's direction. If you look at the top issues, again, the issues are somewhat telling in that all registered voters ranked these things like the economy, the future of democracy, education high. But if you look closely, you could see that there is a key difference between how Democrats and Republicans view these issues. So, for example, Republicans may not think climate change is very important. The Democrats do. And a huge split on things like abortion and gun policy as well. So these are some of the things that were on voters' minds going into the election. So as pollsters were trying to figure out, well, what's going to happen, they took these variables into consideration, and they assumed, wrongly, that the Republicans were going to do really well. Another factor that may have helped was people who self-identify as Republican or Democrats. That trend actually seemed to be helpful for Republicans who, still have a gap with Democrats, but not a tremendously large gap, like say back in 2006, when there was a midterm election and George W. Bush. And of course, you may remember that was the election that brought Nancy Pelosi to power for the first time. In Monroe County, we see a really interesting trend that is mimicked nationally in that the number of Republicans is not particularly high. It's declining somewhat, but independent voters are increasing. We have more independent voters, that is, people who are blank and not affiliated with one of the two major parties in Monroe County than we do Republicans. Democrats still outnumber both. And then I made this nice bar chart, should you want some interesting imagery to accompany that. So just in terms of what's going to happen, and again, the advantage, certainly locally, is to Democrats. What's really interesting on top of all of this is how much partisanship is playing in elections in general. The antagonism between Democrats and Republicans, which is growing every election cycle, as we begin to dehumanize one another based upon whether they have a Trump sign or a Biden sign in their front lawn or on their bumper or wherever, as we begin to disrespect people simply because they are affiliated with one party over the other, that's driving people to vote, but often voting against, not voting for. So people are more likely to say, well, I am so afraid of that political party, I'm going to vote for this other major party, even though exit polls in this election showed that the majority of Americans are just disgusted with both major political parties. They would love to see something else emerge. But when it comes down to it, their fear rather than their hope seems to be what drives them during an election. Open Secrets, which is a terrific place to go and find money in politics, because it covers not just the FEC, but other sources of funding, notes that a projection of almost $9 billion was spent in this midterm election, and those numbers are probably not thorough. We will probably continue to see that number grow as more data comes in on the spending in races across the United States. That's a lot of money to be spending on that. As one person indicated, that kind of money would make a real difference in the lives of some of the poorest Americans and in establishing some funds to refurbish some of our urban areas. In New York, not surprising, the incumbents all raised more money than their opponents, even though outside advocacy groups and political party PACs contributed to that. In general, the incumbents raised more money, which again makes it really difficult for the challenger, makes it difficult in New York State, where the Democrats enjoy a 2-to-1 advantage in our urban areas over Republicans or non-aligned voters. However, again, if you looked at what pollsters were saying, midterms favored Republicans. Some conservative talk hosts, radio hosts, were crowing about a red tsunami, and they were gloating in the days before the election that this was what was going to happen. And as you can see, Dill Day's piece from the week was suggesting that Democrats were just getting prepared for 2024, knowing that they were just going to get swamped in 2022. So what did happen? Well, voting turnout was respectable. It's 56% in Monroe County, according to our friends at the Rochester Beacon. They did a calculation based upon what numbers came out of the Monroe County Board of Elections, but below the 62% we saw in 2018. Where the voters are. If you look at a county map, the northwest side of Monroe County tends to still be the stronghold for Republicans. If you go to the east side of the county, you still have some favorable territories like Webster for Republicans. But as you go into the southeast side, places like Mendon are becoming less a stronghold for Republicans. And of course, the city itself and the inner ring suburbs are trending more and more Democrat each election. So there's an expansion of the Democratic Party as the Republican Party declines in Monroe County. Nationally, it's probably going to come out to a 222 votes. It looks like the uncalled races in Colorado and California are very likely to go for the Republicans, which means they would have a net gain of 10 seats, which makes them the majority party, which again, I mean, that's significant. It will certainly affect politics for the next 24 months, but it is not a wave by any imagination. It's clearly just a slight move, which speaks to how deadlocked we are as a country and how we seem to be paralyzed in this political situation in which people have to choose. And when they do, as one voter said to me, I feel like I have to hold my nose and vote against the other party. The Senate, now this is very surprising and historic. Incumbent presidents don't usually win seats in the Senate, but the Democrats picked up a seat. They flipped Pennsylvania. That's huge. There is a runoff election in Georgia, and that could very well go to who the incumbent is, Raphael Warnock, who could beat Herschel Walker based upon some of the polling we've seen. What leads to the Georgia runoff is that, according to their law, you have to have 50% of the popular vote in order to win. And there was a third-party candidate, a libertarian, was running in that race. That might be helpful if those voters who do sort of lean towards the Republican Party cast their ballot for Herschel Walker. But frankly, they might just stay home. And if they do, that's going to help Warnock. So it could actually be a 51-49 Senate, which actually solidifies Democratic control. And again, that's just tremendous. Of all of the seats that were considered to be, somewhat challenging, the Democrats picked it up. Interestingly enough, in New York, which is solidly Democrat, the Republican Party did really well. If you look at the numbers at which the governor's race and some congressional races went, Republicans actually outperformed what they did 2 years ago in the presidential election. That is, more Republicans or more independents came out and voted for Republicans than they did 2 years ago, but it wasn't sufficient to overcome those independents and the Democratic enrollment advantage. But again, it is interesting to see, for example, Kathy Hochul, typically you would have expected the incumbent party to win 60% of the vote. Certainly the same thing with Joe Morelli, but those margins were much closer to 50. To be considered safe in a congressional seat, we say you have to have 55% of the vote. And Joe Morelli only picked up about 53%. So that'll be interesting. I wonder if there's Democrats out there that are going to be looking at that and thinking, oh, maybe I should primary Joe Morelli and run against him in the next election. Maybe I could be the next member of the House. Lovely Warren, are you listening to me? Because you could be that person. It is. Laron did not do well. Did not win locally, even though there was some speculation. He did very well. And I will point out that turnout in the city was low, or certainly lower than the county. And that may be due to the fact that Laron grew up in the city. In fact, he and Lovely Warren went to church together growing up. And that there may have been some feeling that although I can't vote for a Republican in the city of Rochester, that also voting against somebody who grew up in the city and knows the issues well, that may have been a factor in that. It'll be interesting to see. But again, the question is, why no red wave? Yeah, that's really interesting. So independent voters, they can make, depending on where they are, they can make up anywhere from 25% to 40% of the electorate. Typically, they've voted against the incumbent party. That is, if you look at where they vote, in these elections, they tend to vote against whoever is leading. So in this case, it was expected that more independents would have voted Republican. They did not. They voted for the incumbent party. We know this obviously by both the results, but also from exit polls that were taken. There's a couple of national exit polls that talked to, one talked to like 83,000 voters and one talked to 94,000 voters at the end of this election. And it turns out that many of them opposed Donald Trump. That, in fact, if you look at how they feel about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and the economy and all these other factors, you would have expected they would have voted Republican, but a lot of them came out to oppose Donald Trump. Donald Trump was not on the ballot, but he was in this way. As the de facto head of the Republican Party nationally, a former president, he had a lot to say about what candidates ran. His endorsement allowed a number of Trumpites to win primaries against more established or conventional, or might even say moderate Republicans. And so as a field of candidates, uniformly, his picks lost. When you look at the candidates that lost in those key Senate races, they lost because they'd been endorsed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump, when he went to places like Pennsylvania, supposedly to talk about Dr. Oz, spoke a great deal about himself and his grievance about the 2020 election. That did not help Republicans. So that's something that Republicans are going to have to walk away from this, knowing that Donald Trump is no longer an asset, but a liability on their books. And they need to figure out how to deal with that. So, for example, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona exceeded Biden's vote in 2020. That is, the candidates that ran against Trump-endorsed candidates exceeded Biden and picked up votes, 90% in PA, 28% more votes in Georgia, 30% in Arizona. That is astonishing. And so Donald Trump loomed over this election in a way that was quite favorable to the Democrats. I can't say that people voted for Biden or his policies. I can say that they voted against Donald Trump and having his election deniers in office. Independent voters were particularly concerned about democracy, and they were particularly concerned about the rhetoric that the election of 2020 was stolen. There is no evidence, a court case after court case in states has failed to provide any evidence of some sinister plan. But Donald Trump continues to argue that that's what happened, despite facts getting in his way. The other factor was abortion politics. Independents and Democrats found that abortion was a critical issue for those people who actually voted. If you looked at the pre-election poll by Gallup about what the concerns were, abortion was kind of middling. The economy or crime seemed to be higher. But when it came to the actual day, and the exit poll showed that there was a real concern that abortion rights were going to be removed should Republicans take control of the House and the Senate. Abortion rights was the 27%. 60% of exit polls showed that people were unhappy with the Supreme Court ruling. In Michigan, where Democrats ran on a pro-abortion platform and declared that they would repeal a 1931 law that had been made abortion illegal, those Democrats won. They flipped control of the entire state legislature. So now that law will be repealed. In Pennsylvania, Dr. Oz was wishy-washy on how he felt about reproductive rights. But yet Fetterman came out and had many campaign ads featuring his support for abortion rights, and he flipped a seat held by the Republicans. And if you look at Connecticut, California, and Michigan, we also saw attempts to put restrictions on abortion in places like Kentucky and Montana were voted down, despite the fact that in Kentucky, the Republican candidate, Rand Paul, cruised to victory. So abortion was a critical issue. Democrats know that, and they will keep that message going forward to 2024. Not only did Democrats do well in some of the states I've mentioned, they won what we call the trifecta. They now control the state legislature and the governorship in a number of states. So this is critical for judicial appointments, for legislation, for making sure that you can't have a divided government. So really interesting in Massachusetts, historic elections there. And so we saw the defeat of Republican governor and the installation of a Democrat. So we expect that, Democrats are walking away from this election knowing that the campaign that they ran was very solid. So what can we expect nationally? Well, I think Biden's not necessarily going to go away. He's the oldest president ever elected. And Democrats were basically praying that he would not run in 2024. But his party picked up a seat in the Senate. They only lost 10 seats. That gives, Joe Biden an advantage in saying to people, look, I'm the one who can defeat Donald Trump again, should he run. And Donald Trump has declared just days after the election that he was going to run, even though Republicans were already blaming him for not taking the Senate. The other key we can expect is that Ron DeSantis is now looking like perhaps the leading Republican candidate since he flipped a Democratic county in Florida and won his race against former Governor Charlie Crist by 20%. Huge gain for Ron DeSantis. So you expect him to be on the ballot in 2024. Maybe not, maybe he won't win the primaries, but we'll see. Domestic policy. Well, look, the GOP is going to run the House. So you can imagine from now on, everything that Joe Biden wants to accomplish is going to meet the roadblock of the Republicans who are going to try to wait him out for 2 years. That means things like the budget, just passing a budget is going to be very difficult. The debt ceiling, raising the debt ceiling is going to become very hard. Any signature legislation, it's not going to even get out of committee. So the Democrats are now going to be stymied in the House, which means you can't expect anything to happen. If the Senate passes something, the House won't. And so it doesn't become law. Indeed, Joe Biden will have to lean on the executive orders more and more and more. I do expect to see more Democrats appointed to a judiciary, though, because the Democrats control the Senate and they should be able to eke in some of their appointments. Meanwhile, Joe Biden will be making speeches, no doubt, about the do-nothing Congress or the obstructionist Congress or what have you, as he attempts to achieve his goals. Will Joe Biden be conciliatory? I don't know. I have to say, he said when he was elected, he was going to work across the aisle, but he really didn't. So I can't imagine with the progressive wing of his party being so powerful that Biden is going to find getting any legislation passed possible. Perhaps something in terms of the economy, some sort of economic plan, but I don't expect a lot to come out of the White House. Meanwhile, Kevin McCarthy, who is the minority leader, may not be the House Speaker. He's got a fight on his hands. They're angry at him because the Republicans were predicted to have a red wave, and he only got 10 seats. But do expect the GOP to begin investigating Joe Biden, especially Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden's laptop investigations of the FBI are also expected. The FBI was seminal in the 2016 election with the Russian plot and all of that hokey pokey. And then, Hillary Clinton, I mean, it was a mess. I suspect the FBI is going to get a shakeup. GOP will try to stop funding for Ukraine. They've already been dragging their feet on sending more money to aid the Ukrainians in their fight against Russia. They will pass legislation in the House. They will expect it to be vetoed so that they can then have a campaign issue to run on in 2024. Joe Biden didn't want to save America's whatever. Joe Biden stopped. Joe Biden hates children, something like that. You can expect that to happen soon. I do expect to see some sort of work on voting legislation. Again, Republicans, the day after the election, were already grousing about early voting and why does it take so long for votes to be counted? As we sit here, again, the Colorado and California races are not yet called, and it's been several weeks since the election. So, again, New York State has laws and policies in effect so that we can have our votes counted, or certainly the bulk of them, on election day. And I wouldn't be surprised to see some sort of movement for that in the future. The Republicans are very antsy about voting integrity. So I don't know that will get out of the House, but I do expect it to happen. All right, so what does it mean for New York? Yes, Kathy Hochul, Anthony Delgado. I mean, look at this, right? This is great. The state remains in Democratic control. GOP shifted legislative and congressional seats in the New York City area, but the Democrat supermajority in the New York State ledge remains. So if Kathy Hochul decides she wants to veto her own party's legislation, they can easily override her. I don't know why they would, but perhaps a scenario will occur when that happens. I doubt it. But Hochul is the first woman elected governor of New York. She's the first person from Western New York in a century to be governor. That's huge. She won large majorities in both New York City and then out in Central and Western New York. She definitely has political capital. The problem with Kathy Hochul, she doesn't have a vision. On the day after she was elected, she talked to the Buffalo News, her hometown newspaper. She grew up in Hamburg. She's very well known there. She and Jerry Zaremski went to school together. They know each other. So she talks to the Buffalo News all the time. And they asked her what she was going to do. And she said, well, what I've been doing. If there's any kind of vision for Hochul, we'll see it in the budget that she's going to unveil beginning in the new year. But, I suppose she might continue some climate change action to bring the wings of the Democratic Party together. Maybe she suggested she'd look at the data and maybe tinker with some of the criminal reform measures. That's been very concerning to voters in New York. She's definitely stressed affordable housing. Housing costs are getting out of sight, and it's very difficult for young people, many of whom are on this Zoom, to buy a house now, what with inflation. And the other thing we have to think about is, look, we're spending money we don't really have. We got a lot of money from the American Rescue Plan, and some money coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's going to run out. And before all of the pandemic, we are already in arrears in this state. We spend more than we bring in. So I don't know. That's going to be a crisis that's going to be coming down the pike. So do keep that in mind. I guess you can always raise taxes on the rich who will then, move to Florida and live with Ron DeSantis, Tom Golisano. We did pass Proposition 1, which means really we can now avoid a Michigan scenario here, because some of that money is supposed to create clean drinking water for all of us. Wetland protection. I think we're going to see more expansion of the forever wild. I think we're going to see some removal of buildings and construction in wetland zones. We're certainly going to be more money for shoreline erosion. SUNY and the City University of New York are supposed to get new green buildings or new upgrades to their facilities with this money, which, by the way, we're borrowing this money. That's why it had to be a proposition. So once again, we don't really have the money. We're going to borrow it. And then we're going to create zero emission school buses, which will be awesome. So again, climate change, particularly is popular amongst younger generation who vote Democrat. And it's a way to build the base and keep young people loyal to the Democratic Party. Local politics. That's Adam Bello. He is our county executive. He looks like sometimes like he's a deer in the headlights, because he sometimes is. I do expect more that federal funding will come to Monroe County because of the election results. Money for policing, mental health initiatives, healthcare, and continuing. We have this opiate crisis that has not gone away, and it's only gotten worse. So I expect to see some funding locally for that. We do know because of the Proposition 1, so there'll be some construction flowing into local SUNY campuses, Geneseo, although it's not in the county, it's certainly adjacent, and then Brockport campuses. Well, money for climate action, absolutely, and maybe some remediation of shoreline erosion along Lake Ontario, which should also be beneficial to the county. Bello, after the election, unveiled his budget, and his priorities are public safety, crime, public health, wellness, economic workforce development, and infrastructure. So again, we already know one of the highest budgets going forward, and it's going to spend some money in key areas. However, Bello has a problem, and that's because the Monroe County Legislature continues to be divided by the fact that Sabrina Lamar, a Democrat from the city of Rochester, caucuses with the Republicans, who have made her president of the Monroe County Legislature, and that gives them the votes they need to deny Bello his policies. Meanwhile, things between the city and county Democrats can't get better, because right now they're fighting over redistricting while the Republicans sit back. The crescent map that Rachel Barnhart and Sabrina Lamar and some other Democrats have pushed has been denied by Bello, and now we're seeing lawsuits coming based upon the Voting Rights Act and whether or not the Democrats in power are denying and disenfranchising people of color. So that's an ugly fight. I expect that to not get better anytime soon. And that's all, folks. So I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you, Tim. So one question I had in my mind, there was one county ledge seat on the ballot this year. That was District 8 up in Webster. If that had gone Democrat, then all of that Michigas in the county ledge might have disappeared.
Yeah, it would have.
I didn't hear any, I live near Webster. I didn't hear anyone in Webster talking about that as a factor for why they should or shouldn't vote for a Republican or a Democrat. I just wondered if you had heard anything more about that.
Yeah, I don't think there was much in the campaign. I mean, in the few media outlets that I talked to, like City Newspaper, I talked about that because it really would have been significant had Mark John's been defeated, he was kind of holding that seat anyway for Josh Jensen, who had to step out. And they ran, I think, a fairly decent candidate up there, well known, had been in the school district for a number of years. But really, they never framed it in terms of, well, this could give power to the Democrats. But remember, it's Webster. And if you look at that map, Webster is still one of the areas that's more favorable to Republicans. So perhaps they were afraid to bring that up, lest it bring more Republicans out, which then could have had an effect upon other ballot races. I know that James Van Bretero was considered to be somewhat of a strong opponent against Jeremy Cooney, but again, that never materialized either.
Right. Okay. If anybody has a question they want to ask, why don't you stick your hand up or even just unmute yourself? It looks like we're not rushing in here.
All right. I've got two. Linda wanted to what the impact of Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade had. Absolutely, it was phenomenally important that if the Supreme Court had not made that decision, then I think Republicans would have done far better overall. But the fear that women's reproductive rights were being stolen away from them, first by a Republican-appointed court, and then perhaps by politicians who, once they were in power, could now, because the Supreme Court has rejected Roe v. Wade as the law of the land, they could create the most stringent anti-abortion legislation possible. So again, if you look at exit polls, absolutely. The other question is, do you think the fracturing of the Democrats as demonstrated with redistricting had an impact upon the 25 election? Yes, the congressional. I think it did. I think Democrats in the city of Rochester feel that Joe Morelli and the Irondequoit Democrats take them for granted. And I think that's why Sabrina Lamar, she was part of what they call the Black and Asian Caucus, that also there were several people in that who moved over to work with Republicans. I do think that the county and the city Democrats really continue to be at odds. And I think some of the concerns about redistricting is that some incumbents and some of the power that comes out of the county would be lost to the city. And I think that's going to continue to be a fracture point that can only help Republicans in the long run, even as they decline in numbers in this place.
Looks like Jeremy has a question.
Yeah, so we were talking about like the incumbent advantage and how much money incumbents are able to spend on their campaigns. Would there what would like a limit on that spending look like, and would there be drawbacks to that to kind of make things more fair to get people like out and get newer people in, because it feels like corruption can be a problem with people being in government for so long, for so many years? What would that look like?
Yeah, Jeremy, great question. So one of the issues, actually, term limits are not anti-American. In fact, at the Constitutional Convention, there was actual talk of creating term limits. And there was talk when they were passing the Bill of Rights to create some sort of term limit, because our fear of power, right? Once an incumbent gets in, they're in, in some cases for life. It's difficult to unseat them. Not impossible, but very difficult, particularly because they can raise so much money. The problem is, in 1976, in a case called Buckley versus Valeo, the Supreme Court ruled that money in politics was equivalent to speech, and the First Amendment protects your right of free speech. So every time we've tried to pass a law limiting campaign amounts, and we have certainly done that in congressional races, et cetera, they have found ways around that by saying it's speech. So, presumably Morelli and Laurent Singletary were on equal grounds when it came to, getting money from donors of, $3,000 each per election. But then you've got PAC money, political action committee money, or these citizen advocacy groups who make these campaigns. And then let's face it, I mean, if you own a construction firm in America, you are donating to the person that's likely to win the election because you want them to pass legislation that's going to increase your wealth. And so we see a lot of those kind of donors that you can actually look on Open Secrets to see what industries are supporting what candidates. I think maybe not restricting that, but making that more part of the conversation, right? Why doesn't our media go after that more? When they talk about the horse race, they talk about the red wave, they talk about the poll numbers, they should talk about the money, because the money makes it transparent who are the power brokers and who are they giving money to. So I think that might be a better way to raise awareness than trying to limit it, because every time they pass something, they're just going to come up with something else. Dylan?
So on the polling topic, how do we breach the gap of so many people not maybe wanting to answer an unknown number on your cell phone or something like that? Is there a better way that we could get a good idea of who actually is willing to answer a polling phone call or something? Is it better to do it through an app? Like, are there new options coming about?
Yeah, they're trying several different methods, which including sort of internet polls mixed in with some actual phone calls to try to find a reasonable balance. I mean, some polls are better than others, don't get me wrong, but the election and the proximity, in many cases, it just didn't appear, right? Neck and neck races, now suddenly there's a 4 percentage point difference. Some of that has to do, again, with how many independents do you expect to come out, right? It's about modeling always on the last election. And you're like, okay, so last election, 52% of voters were Democrats and 40 were Republicans. And then the other, 8 were independents. And so let's try to find that strategy for that. And you just never know. And we always say this, it's about turnout. I know it sounds lame, but it's like, I mean, I can predict the Buffalo Bills are going to beat, the Minnesota Vikings or the Green Bay Packer, and then, I can see a really bad team show up with Buffalo Bills uniforms on them. And you're like, what happened? I predicted the Bills would win because they had all of these advantages and the spread was this or that. But like a game of football, it's who actually is going to vote. You can have likely voters, registered voters. Registered voters just mean you're registered. I mean, I could register anyone. A likely voter is someone who's already voted in the past. If you voted once, you're more likely to vote again. If you don't have a pattern of regular voting, you're not a likely voter. And so better polling looks at likely voters, not just registered voters. So does that help? Isabel?
If we're aware of how polarized each side is, why hasn't there been a larger push for independents and like third parties to be more funded and more in politics?
Well, presumably New York State, after this election cycle, is going to create state funding that candidates can accept. So presumably this is one of the ways that we're going to clean up politics and corruption in the state. And it's much easier to do it on the state level. But don't forget, the Democrats and Republicans aren't just a party, they are also the people in power. And just as I sort of hinted that the problems between the county and the city Democrats has to do with power and the unwillingness to share it, Democrats and Republicans don't want to share their power with Green Party or some other party. They're not happy when libertarians show up, and they often say, well, they spoiled the election. They took votes away, as if those voters belong. And that's, we talked about this in class. Gerrymandering is a great way to decide whose your voters are, as opposed to other ways. I think if you want to get more people involved, stop these single member district elections. Do what the Europeans do. Have a slate of people in an area instead of by election district. There's nothing that's in the Constitution that says we can't play around with that. We could have, for Western New York, you could have vote for X number of candidates, and we could send a slate of people. We see that when systems like that have multiple multiple member districts, they are more likely to have third parties than we do. We have what we call Duverger's law, and it's the first past the post. And the way we do it, since there can only be one winner per election district, that always tends to reduce the number of parties involved, because there's only one winner, and it tends to lead to a polarized 2-majority party system. We can change that and shake up the system. The other attempt to do this was the where you have ranked choice elections, and you can vote for your favorite, but then should your Libertarian, Green Party, the rent's too damn high party, which was a real party here in New York State for one time, you would vote for them. If they didn't get it, your vote would automatically go to your second choice, which would be probably one of the major political parties. That's also been used in some places to try to increase interest in non-majority party candidates. Mary.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for this. This is really interesting. I'm curious about your thoughts on what the impact is, either in this recent election or in future elections, on not having a prominent newspaper in town. I know City and the Beacon and some others have kind of tried to pick up slack, but it's not the same.
I know it's not, and I know for people under 30, newspapers seem kind of fussy. But even the Democratic Chronicle, which used to have, Gary Craig is a great investigative reporter, but he's like the last one. And so our local newspaper is filled now with USA stories from across New York State. Like you'll get a prominent story on what's happening in Syracuse, but that doesn't cover local politics. And so then you're stuck with the broadcast media, who have very little time, and in order to get people to watch their TV show, they have to put on every sport from kindergarten up. No offense intended to sports, they're great, but one of the reasons there's so much sport on TV is because mom and dad want to see their children get an award, right? So that's why that's Bob Kadira, who became president, first male president, and Nazareth College, said, we're going to get sports teams because then we're going to be in the paper. Yeah. And he was not wrong. He was a genius. But that's one of the reasons you have so much sport time on there. And so that takes away from in-depth reporting, right? And so I think it affects people's understanding of politics. I think we have to reduce it to these ads where it's us versus them kind of mentality. And Twitter seems to be going by the wayside. I know that a lot of liberal progressives are fleeing it. That was never a perfect space, but certainly led to some dialogue. I think we need to recreate some sort of digital platform. Like you said, the city does a great job, and Rochester Beacon does what it can. Gotham down in New York City. But there doesn't seem to be any singular point at which we can have a real in-depth reporting. So, I think that does affect elections and satisfaction.
I had a question I wanted to put to you, and it's about the Republicans in New York State and how they're doing. So I, like many people, was taken by surprise in 2020 when they were, 2021, when they, well, the Conservative Party spent a lot of money on ads against those ballot measures. And, you know, as far as I know, all the people who were in favor of those ballot measures had never even thought that it was a real contest. And yet suddenly at the last minute, there was this flood of money and people did turn out and vote. So that shocked me. And then this year I saw that every district in New York State voted more Republican than they did, I guess, in 2020, I think was what those graphs were showing me. And, you know, we switched several of our congressional seats enough that we could have kept the House from flipping if those hadn't shifted. So are we seeing a trend here? And another part of the question is that I have not seen detailed data on turnout by party in New York. So typically the Democrats don't turn out during off-year elections as much as the Republicans. The Republicans are more consistent in off-year elections. So is that going to change things in 2024 so that, you know, the Democrats might take back those House seats? And, you know, so predict for me what's going on in New York.
Sure. I think I'm going to take your last point first. Is anytime you have what we call a first, pejoratively freshman, not necessarily male, but in their first term, any member of the House in their first term is more vulnerable because they haven't really established. They're still, as I was telling the class a couple of weeks ago, and when you first get elected, you're in your expansive phase. You're trying to move out of who elected you to build working coalitions. And that takes time and money. And so while you're doing that, someone else can come along who's not spending energy on that and really strategize where your weak points are, or tie themselves to some other national figure who's more popular than you are, and then come along and unseat you. So that certainly could happen. I think some of it is the way the districts were drawn, and I didn't talk about this here. I had talked about it with the class a couple of weeks ago. So New York State went through the census, and they had to reapportion. They had to get rid of one seat and devise new districts. And they drew them intentionally, frankly, to reduce the number of Republicans in this state to about 4 Republican seats. That was so obnoxious that the state appellate court, which is really our highest court, the Court of Appeals in New York State, which is, stacked with Democrats, rejected it, and then ordered a special master who created much more competitive seats. I think one of the things we have to be careful about is to see this as a trend in terms of like, oh, suddenly they came out. No, it may be that if you're looking at these districts, they were just drawn by a special master to be less, siding one way or the other. We talk about cracking, that's where you divide voters, or packing them all in. So you've got so many voters who are Democrats that, they can, they're going to elect a Democrat, but they're not going to be able to elect a Democrat in another district. So I think that's one of the stories in New York State. So I would not, I would not take that to heart. I think if you look at, Hochul's victory in terms of statewide politics, look, Kathy did not get elected first time around. Kathy Hochul's great, but it's like her entire life, she sort of like showed up, and then there was a place for her. Oh, county clerk. Oh, congressional seat. Oh, right. So, and again, she doesn't have a vision. As a candidate, she was not as able to connect with voters. Zeldin's mistake, if there was one, was that he spent too much time in New York City, and he did really well there. That's great for him. but he didn't spend enough time in the southern tier and in Western New York in order to get those votes out. So I think, Hochul won. Hochul raised so much money this time around, going to raise even more in 4 years. I don't think any Republican is going to challenge her, anybody with any standing, so that I don't think you're going to see anything close to the turnout Republicans had. So, and I think in the presidential year, you're absolutely right. Democrats will come out full force. And, particularly if Donald Trump is on the ballot, or somebody like him, I think, I don't think that's good for politics, but that's, because people who tell fibs, are not the kind of people we necessarily. Now, I'm not saying politicians have to be completely honest, because no one expects that, but to tell outright untruths that can be verified, like my election was stolen from me, that's bad for American politics. It turns people off. It creates fear, and that is not good. So, but yeah, Barbara, I'm not seeing a trend yet. Again, if anything, the trend is those Republicans are dying out in New York State. Yeah, I think they all moved to Florida, where Ron DeSantis did better. I'm not kidding. I think a lot of New Yorkers who were Republican don't want to stay in New York anymore, and you're going to see them migrate out to North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona, and places like that, because the Republicans tend to be older, and that means retired, and that means they may pick up and move away.
So I have another question. You talked about the effect of the overthrow of Roe v. Wade, which I agreed with your take on it. So, clearly anywhere abortion rights were on the ballot, they were winning. And yet the legislatures in a whole lot of states continue to pass those extremely restrictive laws. So like the voters in, Kentucky and Tennessee appear to care about reproductive rights, except when they vote for members of their own House and Senate. So like, do you see movement going on to build party messaging that can be effective to change the overall tilt in those states?
I in places like Texas and Florida, probably not, because of the huge victories there for Republicans. What Republicans have to deal with are evangelical Christians and some white Catholic voters who feel that abortion, is never acceptable. But most Republicans, I think, as we saw in Kentucky, because they elected Rand Paul,
and Kansas, don't forget Kansas.
Kansas was the special. Yeah, they rejected it too. I think that Republicans want to find a moderate way, right? Maybe it's not going to be, as New York State will have probably some of the most progressive reproductive rights. In other places, there will be no doubt some sort of restriction on how long before an abortion is not legal. But I think the idea of not allowing any exceptions or cutting it off before a woman even knows she's pregnant, which is ludicrous, I think that message is going to be driven home as Republicans are in their caucuses. But that doesn't stop the true believers. They're still going to be advocating for the end of all reproductive rights, and they will have a voice in the Republican Party. So I think as long as you put it up to voters and don't allow politicians to make these decisions, then the voters are going to keep reproductive rights for women, even if they're not as expansive as what we might have in New York.
Which
So-
reminds me of the thing in Florida a few years ago where, the voters voted to re-enfranchise people who had felony convictions. And the politicians are still trying to find bureaucratic ways to keep that from happening, and they're pretty good at it. So,
Yeah.
don't you think it ought to be possible to convince those voters who clearly care about those rights to vote for people who care about those rights? I mean, that's
but
driving me crazy.
they may care about other issues too, right? So, I mean, it's always a constellation. Single issue voters don't really exist. They just prioritize some issues more than others. So, reproductive rights for women, yes. Higher taxes to fight climate change, probably not. That would be the way the Republicans would be thinking, right? So, and this is where, Amy, politics in the old days used to be the politics of the possible. All right, let's find those issues where we have deep, agreement, abiding agreement. Let's do something about those, secure those rights, and then we don't have to debate this anymore because we've come up with a consensus about what should be done. We don't have that anymore. It's the politics of personal destruction. So again, the Republicans are going to continue to bring these issues forward, and so a vigilant electorate is necessary if you want to protect reproductive rights. They're not going to stop in places like Texas and Florida, and they're going to continue to try in places where they may have been defeated this time around. It's
Okay.
not.
Willow has a question.
Willow, hi.
Yeah, so I know in recent years there's been a lot of talk about upstate New York becoming a hotspot for people to start migrating to because of our proximity to the Great Lakes. Do you think that will have in the upcoming years effects on elections and the legislation that's being passed in New York State?
Absolutely, Willow. I think in migration from in other parts of the country would probably bring people who had greater wealth and maybe higher education, because those people tend to be more mobile, right? I mean, they simply can afford to pick up and move. With some of the policies that New York State is putting into place, like the Micron deal that just got done by Kathy Hochul before the election, was $100 million deal that's going to create new jobs. I think that would actually make Western New York tends to be a little bit red, even though Erie County voted for Hochul, it barely voted for Hochul, and that's where she's from. Monroe County voted for Hochul, but the Southern Tier didn't. I think we could see this part of the state become bluer yet, and so I think that in-migration would do that because of the kinds of industries that would attract people to move here, particularly as we're concerned about our resource. Now, unfortunately, Willow, that probably means war with Canada, but we'll deal with them when we have to.
Okay. Looks like we might be running out of questions. Anybody have a last question you want to send us out on? All right. Well, Tim, I want to thank you for being with us again tonight. As always, it's a pleasure to kick things around with you.